Welcome to another episode of the Data Journey. This time we are graced by the presence of Mark Hyland and Christopher Meade from Handi Quilter, and we're going to talk about the data and the machines. That title will probably make a little bit more sense here in a moment. But Mark Hyland is the CEO of Handi Quilter, and Christopher Meade is the senior finance analyst. And the data problem that they faced was that, like many SMBs, they have grown a lot over time. And in that period of time, data has meant different things to different people. So what I'd like to start with, Mark, is what is the history of Handi Quilter at a really high level? And then how has data played a role in the period before your private equity era and then since the private equity era?
Yeah, great questions. The quick version of this is Handi Quilter is about a 25-year-old company. We create products for the quilting industry, specifically in the niche industry, which is called a long arm quilting machine. We won't spend much time there. It's a large machine that puts a fancy stitch in the top of the quilts. The opportunity is when prior to being bought by private equity back in 2005, there was no such thing as really data inside the company, and for probably the first even 5 years after with the data. What we saw from an overall standpoint is that data helps drive decisions, or at least directional decisions, and be able to collect that data in a way that we can utilize that data, see trends, see what's happening inside and outside the organization, and be able to use that for directional information. From my perspective, Luciano, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong or right here, but I don't think data tells you exactly what to do, but it does give you an ability to lean into directional information and be in front of things before they happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. Data is there to inform human decision making. I think there are tasks that are narrow enough, and when you get refined enough with data, that you can automate some decision making directly to data. But when you're talking about big decisions, the kind of decisions that face organizations, especially of your size and age, those decisions are best made using a mix of expert probability, so that's your time in this industry and understanding the trends, combined with data about the economy and the sectors, combined with your own internal proprietary data and the insight that individuals like Christopher will bring. And it's the sum total of those that should drive the direction and the decision making, but it's still a human decision to make.
Yeah, I would say this: we've become more of a data-centric organization. Meaning that data is really critical to our everyday ability to make long-term good strategic decisions, but it doesn't tell us exactly what to do every single day.
And how has data, so you talked about the first period, the first 5 years, but since, we'll back up and talk about the period in which you transitioned into private equity, because there's also another chapter in that story that we'll get to.
Yeah, so I think it's over the years you start recognizing as technology has become better and more readily available to us, and then actually building an organization built around structures and processes, that data continues to be really important. So having that data structure in place from years 3 or 4 all the way to now year 18 or 19 and 20 that I've been around the company is a continuous journey that we focus heavily on as part of our strategic decision-making process every single year. Is how do we use the data to help us get bigger, better, stronger, faster, more efficient as we move through our journey or our cycle as a business or a brand.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that first chapter in the P&E story. Let me back up. Handi Quilter's story with private equity has had 2 chapters. That's what I was trying to say. The first was the initial standing up of, or the purchase of Handi Quilter. And then recently, Handi Quilter was sold. And was it sold to another private equity group or to a private company?
Yeah, I think we've had many journeys with a private equity group. So we've actually had 5 different private equity owners in the last 18 years. So the first stand up is we went out and with a private equity group purchased Handi Quilter from the original founder. That was the first action back in 2005. And since that, additional 4 other private equity groups have been financial owners of the company and have helped us over the years to build and grow and expand to what you saw in that first slide of nearly $900 retail locations across the world now in 55 countries. That's what we utilize private equity to help us do from a financial standpoint. So I don't know, the importance of all of those things is as you get involved with private equity, whether it's in the diligence process or afterwards, data helps those private equity folks understand what's happening, at least from a number standpoint, from both a financial standpoint as well as some of the operational metrics and KPIs that we use that can be measured and looked at on a regular basis.
And you, in one of those five, I believe it was the last private equity exchange, that involved a complicated process of separating off this data ecosystem that you had previously stood up and that had been operating, and then transitioning it to its own standalone system, and then deprecating the old system, and doing that as part of the negotiation in the acquisition.
Yeah, you got that right. You were right in the middle of all that, Luciano. So yes, that is an interesting and challenging process where you take. We had two large divisions inside the organization, and we sold off one of those divisions, and the other one remained itself. And so in that process, we had to break down, remove, manipulate one system out of an existing system, and then restand it back up.
And in the midst of that, Google changed one of the sources from UA to GA4, so that complicated things.
I don't know if there's never anything that's really simple about data, because there's so much new technology that continues to help us drive really great information. So I would say we're always going to have something in front of us. Is about being very true and focused. And then from my perspective as a CEO, look, we think we know data. We probably know it well, but probably not well enough. But utilizing third-party resources who are really in front of all of the trends and keeping us abreast of what we need to be doing is probably even more critical. And so finding solutions out there in the marketplace to help you become more data centric or have more data depth is really critical, I think, for anybody who is potentially listening to this podcast, at least from some of the things we've learned. We've tried to do it on our own, Luciano, as you know, and we did it okay. When we were finding other people to help us, we got much better. And as we're learning and growing, we're becoming even better at what we do with data.
This is a two-part sequential question, first for Mark and then for Chris. In the latest acquisition, what was the role of your ability to produce data for this acquiring company? So Mark, that's really for you. And then Chris, what were those requests like, and how did the system itself play into your ability to meet those requests?
So let's look at it from a broader perspective. Anyone who goes through a buy or sell process, there's this laundry list of things that's usually asked. So it's pretty in-depth. General to start with, and then it takes a deep dive. For us, it was when we had a data or ecosystem with data, creating those requests is a much more simple process, easier to get to, less cumbersome, and partly because we'd been through it before, but also because we had the data mostly readily available, and then utilizing what we use as Power BI to get to it fairly quickly and make it more visible was really quite simple. For us in that sell process, because we were the one being bought, I will call it the tsunami effect that a lot of times PE or the data requests come at you. You feel like a tsunami. We like to reverse that and make the tsunami back to them. So we were be able to generate so much data and so much information that was very good, solid information that they need to be, and send it to them before it was ever requested of us. That I don't know that we ever felt overwhelmed by the pressure of the data request. But I would also ask that of Chris, because most of the time it would hit me and I'd say, hey, Chris, can we get this done?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing Mark's sentiment there. I mean, it's helpful to have your infrastructure and your tools readily available that you can get this stuff out of. You don't have to go and build a house to show these people that I can build a house. The house is there. I can go and get it, and on they go. I mean, yeah, agreeing with Mark too, where the torrent of information that they wanted, we opened the floodgates back to them. So providing spreadsheets, providing documents, providing data, providing tables, all of that information helped them visualize what Handi Quilter was all about so that they could easily deep dive into our information without them having to sift through and sort through a whole bunch of basically just raw data or raw information. It was all presented nicely because the tools were already doing reporting and analytics, and we just gave them the keys and said, here you go.
Well, let's look at the kingdom for which you gave the keys. So this is your data system roughly visualized. You are an on-prem solution, though you're utilizing components that do, so for example, Power BI service, that's still cloud-based. But effectively, we have this Postgres, it says Postgres there, that's actually an error. It's Microsoft-based, containerized data ecosystem that is pulling information from your sources. These are financial sources, these are shipping sources. And Mark, I'm curious here from a global perspective, what the unification of data from such a broad network, such a large organization requires from the source standpoint. But once it's in the database system, all that processing happens, Chris, that you've been referring to automatically. And then you're interacting with it directly through Power BI dashboards. Chris, you're one of many end users. So Mark, I'd like to first delve into this idea of how do you connect all this data from such a big organization, big in your global footprint? And then Chris, as the primary user, how are you also helping other users get into this system?
Well, I think one of the things you have to recognize, or at least what I've learned, is that if data is not an important priority inside of your organization, and we're not talking and utilizing that data, then all of these wonderful charts that you put together or the process in which you'll go through could be meaningless. So for us, it's collecting the information that's most important to us, because I think, Luciano, you would agree, there is so much data out in the world today. We could probably expand this even infinitely beyond what we have right now. For us, it's about what do we need to have? Why do we need to have it? And what will it help us produce so that we can figure out what the next iteration of Handi Quilter is? What's the next opportunity for Handi Quilter, whether that's here in the United States or whether that's globally? That's the critical thing that I've learned is understanding that data has to take a priority inside the organization, plain and simple. Then I think the question you asked Chris is probably even more critical for us, which is how are we going to use that, and why are we going to use that, and when are we going to use that on a daily basis, hourly basis?
Yeah, okay. So latching on to that, I mean, a lot of it is, number one, once we understand the tools that these people are using around the world, there's a lot of third-party resources. There's a lot of things that we don't have a whole lot of insight into, but these companies do. Like in your graphic there, we're utilizing UPS and FedEx and mail every day. And it's really crucial to us to understand how to better capture the data that they are collecting so that we get insight into that and we can make better decisions on that. Like the shipping info is rates. Can we shop rates? Can we get better information out of that? How do we use that to make better decisions? YouTube, what are our insights on that? How many views do we get for our education videos and all of that? So first, it's wrapping our heads around all of these sources that are valuable to us. And then how do we integrate all of that information into this ecosystem that we are looking at here? So it's a lot of talking with these people, the stakeholders, and understanding what data they use currently and how do we kind of conglomerate all of that together into one space where we can kind of link all that together and see kind of the big picture rather than the little silos that everybody works in.
Well, let's give a real example here too, Chris, potentially utilizing all of our shipping data. So the three main groups that we're using, right? USPS, FedEx, and UPS. There's always a continuous rate shopping that's going on. We're always trying to figure out who can give us the best quality of service, who can get us, who and where can we get that particular package to our end consumer in the best way, and at a price that we don't feel like we're getting, too much beat up over. We utilize all the data that they had given to us, plus all of our internal data, to help go out and actually help save more than $500,000 on an annualized basis just this past year by utilizing the data that those three groups gave to us through their APIs that we then put into our system and then started looking at from a more strategic way, and then put in place some third-party processes and systems and dashboards that helped us make a better decision. The result was $500,000 in savings and a better result for the consumer getting their packages much quicker.
Yeah, that's a great story of data. Your system is very hyper-targeted. So one of the things that is unique about your data ecosystem is the absence of a data lake. You strictly have a data warehouse solution with some data marts, specifically for the finance aspects for Chris. That's a departure from the standard approach. Do you feel like you have lost any insights along the way? Do you feel like there's been any data along the way that you wish that you had, that you think is somewhere in the organization but somehow has not made it into this? And had it all just been put into a lake, we could go searching for it and present it.
Wow, that's a loaded question. So my first response is probably not, but I don't know that we know what we don't know. Because we made a choice early on, Luciano, not to do that, and maybe it's because of our unique niche product, and might be because of we don't have 25,000 SKUs. We've got 800 SKUs, where some of those decisions help make for us, and we made them. I don't know, but today I don't know anywhere, and Chris, you should answer this. I can't think of anything off the top of my head where it's like, oh, I wish I would have had. I can't think of any place that we're
I mean, from my own experience, I certainly have run into that. But what's really great about just having Emperitas on our side and just having these linkages already built into our system is, if I know it's there and I don't see it in part of our reporting, I can certainly go in and look into the warehouse and say, okay, I know it lives in my data sources, but I don't see it in the warehouse. Let's just drag that bad boy in there, and then now it's part of the ecosystem too. And then there's other instances where we create a new tool or we're using a new third-party tool, and we want to bring that in as well. It's simple enough where the user says, hey, I really wish we had this info, and I get it from this tool over here. It's simple enough to go and talk to them and be like, hey, let's think of building an API. Let's bring that information in here so that you're not having to look and sift through 5 different places for your information. It all lives in that one specific warehouse that, for us, that's what's driving the information and the analytics. So even if it's not there, we'll find ways to find it and put it in there.
Well, you've also built some interesting data on-ramps for end users using Google Sheets, using spreadsheets. So you met people where they were, rather than create apps for them or create things that would require them to develop some skills maybe in SQL. You met people where they were at. They were good with spreadsheets. So you develop these data on-ramps that ingest spreadsheets or sometimes Google Docs, because then that allows it to be updated in real time.
Yeah, and honestly, that's a great point. And I think users really latch onto that, as they're like, man, data and these APIs and these warehouses, it's a spooky world out there. But they work in spreadsheets. They deal with spreadsheets all day because that's where they live. And I say, hey, you know what? If we can make it easy for you and say, you update this spreadsheet and then this will go live in the data world, they love it because they can update it real time. We're updating from those Google Sheets, I think, every few hours too. So it's basically real-time information, which really helps them too, because they feel like they're involved. And once they feel involved and there's ownership, and giving them these easy on-ramps gets them onto the freeway real quick, rather than trying to use Google Maps to get onto the freeway and they don't know what they're doing.
As soon as we open our mouth and say, let's talk about an API, or then ask them to spell SQL, we've lost them. Right? They just don't know any of those things. As Chris suggested, I think with your help, we've helped all of our team members recognize that we can meet them where their abilities are at. And Chris is exactly right. Most is around spreadsheets or a document that's easy for them to already produce. And it looks similar, it feels similar. It's not something new and has some new acronym to it, or something that they've never heard of, or they don't have to worry about quote unquote programming.
I think that's what's really great about this evolving technology world too, is I don't think they ever thought that they could put something into a spreadsheet and that would go live real time into an analytics tool. Like just that connection for them is, and for me, it's amazing that we can do this kind of stuff now.
Yeah, that is one of the benefits of a hyper-targeted solution is it's very flexible and it's very fast. Well, Mark, you might be the king of this land, but you still answer to a higher power.
Yes,
And,
unfortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it.
And I'm curious how the system, because you've been there for a while, so you had experience prior to, during, and now after these various transitions of the data warehouse and the ecosystem itself and insights. How has this data ecosystem shaped the relationship that you have with the board?
There's probably 3 or 4 questions in there, so let me see if I can address a few of those. One is, maybe we take it from a little bit different approach here, Luciano, which is how does a board or a private equity group use or expect to use the data of an operating company? So we as operators are using this data every single day to make sure that we're making decisions that will allow us to execute against our strategic decisions. And we're going to use that data in a very tactical approach. When we're sitting at a board level, think about moving up 20,000 or even a 40,000 foot view where the board's looking at the financial opportunities. Where is the trends moving? What's happening there? When you can actually look at those information and provide data and the data ecosystem that we have in real time, sitting in a board meeting and literally clicking on my computer and saying, oh, that's really interesting. You guys are taking this maybe a little bit different approach. Let me show you. And I literally can pull it up on my laptop utilizing Power BI, make a few little adjustments and either show them a chart. I can show them a table. I can show them a visualizational tool that can quickly answer their question and they can visualize it. The reality is they recognize A, we're on top of our game and we know what we're talking about, and B, that we're ahead of what they're thinking. So it's not the board driving the decisions. The board is helping us look at long-term strategies and approaches versus every single day. For an operator like myself, that's a much better way to have a relationship with a board, is asking them for help on long-term solutions or to look at things from a different perspective or bring their insights from the boardroom down to the operating level versus having them wonder, what are you doing on an everyday basis to drive X, Y, or Z that's really a daily activity or a monthly activity? So data for me is an incredible tool that gives me those powers. My superhero powers are my data sitting in my back pocket that I can pull out every single time with the board and really almost overwhelm them with the amount of information that we have in a way that they can see it and understand it very quickly.
Yeah, it's one thing to have data deluge if it's not worthwhile information, but when it's hyper-focused and in your case, hyper-relevant because of the data-centric culture that you've created there and the iterations of the system over time and your insights over time, you're presenting a mass of information in easy to digest ways, but it's about relevant things that they're curious about.
Yeah, and look, every board's going to have some curiosity, and you're also going to have board members there who are, I've done this way for a very long time. And when you can attack and share the information on either of those, I'm curious to, I know the best, and you support it with what you know, to your point, Luciano, being around a long time, but also then support it with data. It's a very powerful tool.
And Chris, how have the real-time insights affected your relationship and the activity of other decision makers and stakeholders inside of Handi Quilter?
Man, I'll say it's extremely important. I will say Mark gets on me every once in a while when it's not as real time as it could be. But I think that's what helps is our stakeholders, the people who care enough that they want to see that it's real time and that it's up to date because they want their finger on the pulse to help them think long term, like Mark was mentioning there. We don't want to get bogged down in the day-to-day and creating these reports and making sure that things are correct. To us, the importance is that it is correct so that we can see that, plan around it, strategize around it, and make it worthwhile for us rather than just getting bogged down, like I said. So the importance of being up, and the tool is not having downtimes, and that the data fidelity is as clear and as correct as can be is of great importance to us.
Let me add this too, Luciano. I think it's really interesting. I was just thinking about this, Chris, as you were talking. How many times, 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago, whatever it's been, would I walk into a meeting with our own team or with the board, and we would be beginning to talk about a certain product, a certain category, something that was important for us, and we would whip out our spreadsheets. And in that room, we would have 6 variations of a spreadsheet that was supposedly pulled from the same source, being the ERP system, and they would have all 6 different pieces of information and 6 different conclusions, right? Today, I can't think of a time when we're walking into a meeting, whether it's at the board level or another, where that happens any longer. We're all looking at a single source, pulling through our data, our data ecosystem, and we're all looking either at a dashboard or we're pulling from the same table the information, and it's the data is all the same now, and the conclusions are more linked and forward-looking and in line versus having 6 different conclusions, and then we spend the next 3 days figuring out where that data came from and how we got to it, even though we pulled it from the same source in the same report. That, for me, is one of those things you go, aha, finally, to Chris's point, we've got team members going, oh, this is great. And it only took me 3 minutes to do that versus 3 hours to build a spreadsheet.
Yeah, the single source of truth is a big problem for brands to overcome, and creating the data ecosystem is a step in the right direction, but it does take the kind of feedback that Chris was talking about earlier, where people are stress testing something. If they don't want to use it, then you never discover that something is wrong, because if they're not looking at it critically. And when the problem that you're outlining, Mark, was doubly destructive, because not only were people all producing different results, but then trying to troubleshoot what was going on, you had 6 wasted efforts rather than 6 people all weighing in on the same thing and what's going wrong with it.
Talk about inefficiencies. That is the poster child for inefficiencies and wasting time.
Well, Mark, you have been described by someone close to you as the best people person that they know. This is something that I witnessed myself coming to Handi Quilter and doing some of the trainings. It's something that other people, not just this person, have expressed in similar terms. And it's something that I've seen even through your LinkedIn. And I'm putting the people here in quotes because this is people who are your team members, who work at Handi Quilter, who are rabidly loyal when I visited, and the customers who I see constantly pictures of you traveling around and interacting directly with these customers. I'm wondering, if at all, how data has impacted these relationships that you have with people.
Well, I think there's two big pieces here. One, you're asking about data, and the other about people. All of us have leadership styles. I will say this from a leadership standpoint is I've had some great mentors that I liked certain things that they did, and there's definitely things that I didn't like that they did. And I would adopt some of the things that they like, and I would say, I'll never do that. And one of the things I learned very early on in my career is that you need to surround yourself with people who are much better, much smarter, have much more intelligence than you do, and give them as much ability to go get the things done they need to. With this caveat is, there's this lovely word that Chris will start laughing at probably, because it's one of my little buzzwords, which is called accountability, right? You can't give people responsibility without giving them accountability. So for me, it's building up people and bringing on the people who are smart and intelligent and giving them every key responsibility they can manage and want to run, but you got to give them those accountabilities. And amazingly enough, when you hold people accountable, even when it's really hard, if you want to call it loyalty, if you want to call whatever you want to call it, there is an ability to have a really good conversations with people, which includes crucial conversations when things are difficult or they're easy. We've had plenty of challenges in our businesses where we've had to have some really tough conversations. And then you can have an open, honest conversation because we've built a relationship. People are about relationships. Now, your second part of the question is, how does data drive those things? Well, data helps me understand. We look at our end consumer. There's 10 million quilters across the United States. We have more data about those particular quilters than anyone in the industry. And I say that not from an ego standpoint, but I know that because this whole industry of $4 billion is not one that collects a lot of data. And we have a plethora of data. Again, that helps us look to those people, and people are about relationships. If I can know and understand what my end consumer is asking for, all it takes is for me to listen. Once I listen, then I can act. I'm not reacting. If I'm acting and I'm building a relationship with them, whether it's my product, whether it's our services, whether what we do or how we do it, we will be much more successful because we've utilized data as one of those components. Data doesn't solve everything. It doesn't give us the perfect answer, but it does give us a leg up on every one of our competitors from the standpoint of we know who our customer is. We also know who every one of our direct competitors' customers are, and we know how to bring them to our brand in a way that will build relationships.
Well, and if done correctly, it sounds like the data can be the tool in the accountability of your team to their goals, then the accountability of the organization to the customers.
It's definitely one of those key components.
And Chris, how have you seen on the other side of this? Because I know that you've nurtured and guided people on producing Power BI reports. Power BI is the main tool you're using. How have you personally, through the data, connected with team members? Is this something that's a point of friction often or a point of collaboration? And then with the customers, where you're specifically in your role tied with the finance, how has your impression, I guess, of the customers changed because of the data?
Good questions. So I'm going to latch on to Mark's with the accountability first there. So I think what really helps is getting buy-in from these people means that they have to believe in the tool and the system and the data. And so when they understand that what they do is driving the reporting, the visualization, then it helps them understand that everything that they're doing is driving the business. It's driving the decisions. It's driving all of the underlying information that we're getting and we're gathering and we're also putting out there. Recently in my own personal life, I've been talking about friendships and relationships, and it's a two-way street where you have to be facilitating and they have to be facilitating back to you. You have to be providing good data that they can make better decisions and it helps them in their job. And at the same time, they have to be giving me good data and good information so that I can help them. So it's a circle. It's that old Lion King circle of life kind of deal for me. And if you're not following through on that, then the circle's going down and everybody is kind of just, they're dying out there. So it's really that important for me. And yeah, it can be friction at times when people, again, they're hesitant with data. They don't know what they're doing. So you have to kind of walk them through it, handhold at times. Trainings that you guys gave them definitely empowered a lot of our users to say, hey, I have Power BI and I have access to all this cool stuff. I can go and build that. And I gladly encourage a lot of my users to say, hey, if you want to build this, feel free to go at it, man or woman, and build this tool and let it help you make our lives easier. Let's not get bogged down in the old school ways of creating reports. Let's take the time to build this and then let that instant tool help you move on and look forward rather than behind.
Chris, I thought you were going to break into the Lion King song, man. I thought you were going to bring up little Simba, hold him up. And
Simba cool. Sounds like it would be the name of an AI.
Let me tag onto this. I think this is interesting. So this is my perception too. So Chris, correct me if I'm wrong here. In many organizations, when you have somebody from the finance team or maybe even the data team, but mostly coming from finance, approach you, say, we need to have a conversation. Most people push back because they know, oh, they're coming to ask for stuff. What I perceived here over, I'll say the last several years is when Chris now calls out or calls a meeting or is working with a team, it's because of what the data and the ability the data is giving this team, they're recognizing that Chris is reaching out saying, hey, we have some things that we can work on together. And they're very interested in what the questions may be or what answer they're trying to get. And it's a very collaborative effort. And it's not this pushback. It's not the cook in the kitchen. Like there's not this clashing that's going on. There's really good discussions. Are there arguments? Absolutely. But they're very collaborative in nature, saying, why do we need to do that way? What is it really going to give us? Couldn't we do it this way? Versus, oh crap, Chris is just asking me for more stuff.
Yeah, I have a good use case on this one actually, and one that I've recently built is our warehouse manager, our operations guy, was spending time putting together 5 different reports into one that all his team had to also put together. So let's say that's 25 reports that his whole team had to put together that they were spending hours on of their day just to get some information. I sat down with him and said, hey man, let's look through what your team is currently doing and let's see how we can simplify this, because I know and you know that you don't want to be spending time cleaning up columns on a spreadsheet or doing all of this nonsense that you can use these tools to leverage and do. So they now have one report on Power BI that they go to every day, and they're using constantly to make their decisions, decide what they need to build during the day, decide if they're out of stock or need to plan for purchasing. Like all of that information is in one report now for them, and they're constantly using. These 5 team members now use that for 1 hour a day potentially, instead of spending half of their day just generating it before they could even start to get down and analyze and make decisions on it.
And I would say we're doing that. Look, we're not there yet, but we're doing that across the organization. Whether it's the operations team or a sales team is a good example. We don't want our sales team out there getting into the data and trying to figure stuff out. They've got some click-through dashboards now that Chris and others have helped them build, where in a matter of 30 seconds, they can see what happened the previous day, or they can look at that customer that they're walking into to talk to, and they can pull it up with literally a couple clicks, and it's at their fingertips, and we're not requiring them to do their own analytics. We're requiring them to do their jobs and do their jobs really well.
Yeah, this is, again, where you have been really successful in meeting people where they are. So figuring out this is just like the data on-ramps. This is the flip side, giving them dashboards and ways to interact, the visualization layer, given the skill sets that they have. Because you also have some people who are pretty savvy with some of this data. I mean, Chris is obviously one of them. But you have other team members who are to differing degrees. I mean, one of the trainings that I did there were about 7 or 8 power users at that point. And these were people who typically are really good in Excel, and they find that Power BI has a very low learning curve. And Power BI and the salespeople and all of these end users bring up the need for governance. So I'm curious how Handi Quilter has gone about governance. You have a data governance committee, and what that creation was like, and what this part of the role, because a lot of the time there's so much focus on the technology, people forget that at some point this becomes a system that someone has to own or people have to own. And part of that, an important part of that, is getting end users access to the appropriate portions of the system.
I'll say this is probably one of our areas we can still have a lot of improvement in. Would you agree, Chris?
Absolutely. This has certainly been my goal since I've kind of taken on this role of helping with the data warehouse and doing admin for Power BI. Is how do you make people trust the tool? How do you make it so that they can rely on this information? And a lot of that comes from the governance. So it's giving the people the access to the things that they need to access. It's making sure that they're not getting confused by things that they shouldn't be seeing, because sometimes people just click around and they don't know what they're doing. So it's training, it's helping put in footnotes. It's a lot of it is who is all touching it. So out of governance, it's who's the input and who's getting the output, and making sure that the input upstream is as clean as can be is a lot of this governance. So if we ever run into issues and someone's questioning it, we sit down and say, hey, how would this come up? And what are we doing in our process that might be causing this issue? So having these kind of guidelines, or at least an expectation out of the governance really helps us kind of run through and make sure that we're on track. So even just looking at your graphic here, the ownership is everyone. Like all of us own this information and this data, and we all rely on that information. How we're classifying it is the same as how do we need to classify it and how do we make that speak to us? And Mark and myself and the IT team, they help drive some of that information and help guide a lot of the other team members who are looking to do that. And then the access, again, is making sure that we're giving them the tools at their fingertips that they need, and we're not giving them the other tools that could really bring it back. And they might be hesitant because now they have a tool that they have no idea what to do with.
Or even unintentionally mislead them. I think that's part of what Mark was talking about earlier with the sales teams, is sometimes they get into tools that they have access to, and they run processes that to them seem reasonable, but because they don't understand the origin data story of the database, the origin story of any of the data in the database, it can lead to very wrong conclusions.
Absolutely.
Here's something I would say, Luciano, too. Look, you pose the question, how do we do a committee? It's a small group. We're trying to keep it very consistent. So consistency is one of the hardest lessons to learn from my perspective. If we've outlined what it is, then we need to keep going with that until we learn that we need to make some change. And if we're going to make some change, the question is why? And you have to follow that up question with why is, then what happens if you do X or Y? What will happen with all the other data? Where does it go? When it happens? I think our hardest thing that we continue on occasions to struggle with is the consistency. Easy case use. We create a new product. That new product needs to get into not only our ERP system, but from our ERP system into all of our data, into our data warehouse. How many times do we find, Chris, that all of a sudden we've missed one of those products? Now, the great thing is we can see it immediately because it's like, wait a second, I don't see that in whether we're looking at a dashboard or another Power BI report, but it's that consistency from my perspective, Luciano, that we still have to work on. Why do we do it? When do we do it? How do we do it? If we're changing, it's those same questions to make sure we're consistently on top of everything we're doing, and it'll help drive us to even be better all the time. But that's what's happened for us, and that's where we've made some of our own mistakes.
Yeah, I'd add on to that too, that communication is another C that's part of that consistency. Is we're fallible as humans, and communicating as best we can is a great effort, and it's hard sometimes. Like, how do you communicate even if I'm just using my tool? I'm in my little silo in Sage in my ERP system and on I go. Like, how do you make that message across the board so that everyone is aware and all of the tools and all of the resources that are tied to this are communicating to there? You need human communication and you need your resource, your data communication. So it's an ongoing battle for sure.
Other than governance, which let's back up and just point out credit where credit is due here. The fact that you have a governance committee and they are meeting in any kind of regular fashion is a step ahead of most organizations who currently have data ecosystems, which are still a small portion of the overall number of brands out there globally and in the United States. So in those two ways, you're a leader. You were an early adopter and leader in the unified data ecosystem where all of your data at one source of truth was, and you were a leader in getting governance in place for the system. And the fact that the system has been up 99.9, it's some fraction of 99% of the time, which Chris said earlier, that's one of the high priorities. That's in part attributable to the fact that you do have data governance. You do have ownership, classification, and access control. But other than governance, what have been the other hard lessons learned in this process, which is, like Mark pointed out, multi-year?
So I would probably point to a couple things that lessons learned, whether they're hard lessons or not. I think there's some lessons learned for people. One is make sure you're taking the time and the appropriate measures to understand the what's and whys as you start getting into all of your data, and whether you're doing a data lake or a data warehouse, what is the ultimate goal and opportunity? Two, I would say, is we struggled early on because we chose to try to do things ourselves versus getting some experts. So I'll give a plug to Luciano and his group. Whether it's them or somebody like them, there's plenty of great teams out there, Luciano and his team being at the very top of that, who help you navigate some of those opportunities where you may think you know what you're doing, you probably don't. That was a hard lesson to learn to some degree. The third thing was, once you made those decisions, you need to be able to communicate clearly to the organization the why we're doing those things, because making change for any organization is difficult. And from my perspective, although the outcome of data is wonderful, the journey to get there can be difficult, and consistently reminding them of why we're doing this, what the ultimate goal and objective is, how it will help them do their jobs better, how it will make their life easier. I think, Chris, most of our team would say today that the things that we're doing around our data have made their tasks, their responsibilities or accountabilities much more simple than being bogged down in reports. But
my key phrase, at least for myself, is I work really, really, really hard to be as lazy as I can when I'm working. So that means I got to work real hard up front to build these tools and let the tools do what they need to do so that I can sit back. And I don't want to say lazy, I guess, to that point, but I can be looking forward rather than just tearing my hair out because I can't figure this report out.
Lazy. I'm going to write that one. Lazy. Evaluations are coming up. Lazy.
Maybe that data is going to end up in the warehouse, Chris.
Yeah.
It's all right. I was true. It's true data, at least.
Well, one of the things looking to the future that I know is currently ongoing and has been for some time now is the use of outside data sets. Mark hit on this earlier. There's just unending amounts of data out there. If you know where to look, then this does come to some of the expertise, and then you know how to grab it and utilize it. Much of this is free and freely available. You are tapped into some of those macroeconomic data sets, and this is because of a concern around the market volatility. I'm curious what the predictive modeling efforts, Chris, this is, I think, really for you, have been like in the last few years because of the pandemic effect, which I'm not sure if Handi Quilter was counter-cyclical, if things boomed for you during the pandemic, like some of your some of the other brands in your industry, but how has that recent volatility in the data affected your ability to continue to use and feed these macro models to predict what's going on or what's coming at you?
I mean, I'll tell you, it's hard, especially when you're looking at kind of your recent historicals, because that's what a lot of boards and groups and organizations do is they say, hey, what's my trailing 12 months, or what's my last 3 years, or my last 5 years look like? And then these last 5 years have just been volatile as hell. Like there's COVID, there's supply chain issues, there's now inflations or depressions, there's unstable foreign markets. So it's really hard to go back and say, yeah, I want to be like my last 3 years, but the last 3 years were a roller coaster. So you need to have better predictive modeling to say, what data points can I actively rely on to make a better trend rather than just doing your regular average trends or your last 12-month trends or any of that. So it's extremely important to try and have machine learning and all this other stuff take some of that guesswork out of these things and let a lot of the data and the information and removing your outliers and all of that to get a better trend line to make these decisions on. I tell you, it's been tough, but I'm glad that there's tools out there that help with this.
And Mark, do you feel like the efforts, the fruits of that labor have helped you navigate the market volatility with data?
I think Chris is right. It helps to a degree. The volatility of when those swings occurred, whether you were counter-cyclical or not, there's still some, and predictive modeling is taking all of that data and trying to predict it forward, whether you had a high or a low. It probably made it simpler to work through, but it definitely wasn't easy. Before we might have used that magic 8 ball to get through it. You really can't use that magic 8 ball on anything at this point in time. But data does help maybe smooth out that process a little bit.
Chris, you talked about going back a few years, but the organization obviously has decades worth of history. How far back do you tend to go with your data when you're trying to do the typical work that you're being asked to do?
I mean, some of these are actually reliant on those kind of phases in Handi Quilter's life, right? The story that Mark started us off with is these different private equity groups bought Handi Quilter or were involved with Handi Quilter in different stages of their life. I mean, it's hard to rely on information that's 15, 20 years old because Handi Quilter just isn't in the same space. Their market share is different. The economy is different. Buying power from consumers is different. So we tend to rely on more recent years. I think a lot of our reports go back potentially 4 or 5 years, and that's about our time frame we use. But a lot of it is what's my last quarter, what's my year over year, we do use the trailing 12 months in discussions with our board. It's that kind of information, but again, you always have to take something with a grain of salt because of some of this volatility that you have to asterisk it and maybe do a little bit of smoothing or take a little bit of a guesswork into it still. I mean, educated guesswork, but still it's a little bit of that thumb in the air.
Yeah, the last few years have made data sets very, very interesting to deal with. Well, Mark, I want to give you the final word here because earlier you said something that this $4 billion industry, which has 10 million individuals just in the United States that are part of that community, for the brands that are out there in this space who have not adopted data or haven't started down that data-centric path that you're on, what would you give them as a piece of advice as a first step? Like, if they're going to go through the effort to follow your lead, what is the first step?
Well, if they're my competitors, I'll say, do nothing. You're doing great right now, right? From an industry standpoint, I think you can look at this industry and many other industries that are maybe more hobbyish-like or maybe a little more niche-y than maybe some of the bigger industries. You know, a $4 billion industry, as far as the GDP across the U.S. goes, is pretty small. The reality is, wherever you are, whether you're $1 million company or $100 million company or $1 billion company, the question I would pose to you is, how can you make your time be more utilized and more effective and efficient? Question mark. I believe that utilizing data will create an ability for you to free up 50% of your time, maybe even a little bit more. If you spend the quality time of saying, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? What information do I have today that if I could put it into some sort of data set that I could extract from easily and simply, how much more time would I save in just creating reports? I can be more critical in the questions that I'm asking. I can be much more curious about where we're going and why we're going from just that data set. I think the data component of this could be a very important opportunity for you to have a leg up on many of your competitors. That's my perspective.
Well, on that high note, let's wrap up there unless there's anything else either of you want to discuss or other ideas or thoughts you have.
No, we'll just tell you thank you. Thanks for all your help.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate you taking the time this morning out of your very busy schedules to join me and tell your story. Handi Quilter is a leader in this space. It's well known. Whenever I mention Handi Quilter, there's a specific kind of person out there in the public that perks up immediately. They know everything about long arms. So the loyalty of your staff has extended to those 10 million people in the United States. So congratulations to both of you on the success with data. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us on this episode of The Data Journey, and we'll see you at the next one.